welcome to all of you today. My name is Marc Tessier-Lavigne, and I'm the president of the Rockefeller University. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to our 14th annual Women and Science Lecture and Luncheon. This is my first Women and Science Luncheon, and I can already tell that this is an extraordinary event. I'm happy to see so many friends of the university here today, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome those of you who are visiting campus for the first time. I'm about to begin my third month here at Rockefeller as president, and it's both an honor and a privilege to head one of the world's leading biomedical research institutes and to work with an eminent group of scientists. Founded in 1901, the university has an unparalleled record of achievement and has been home to some of the world's top scientists and the site of key breakthroughs, including the discovery that genes are made of DNA. In fact, over the years, 23 Rockefeller scientists have received the Nobel Prize. This is an extraordinary track record of success. Now, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge this year's Women in Science leadership. And I ask those of you who are here today to please stand and be recognized as I read your name. And I ask the others to please hold your applause until I've read everyone's name. So our luncheon chairs are Judy Berkowitz, Katerina Drakopoulos, standing over there, Samantha Boardman-Rosen, great, Patricia Rosenwald, and Lulu Wong. Our founding chairs are Lydia Forbes, Isabel Furlow, Nancy Kissinger, and Sidney Schumann. And I'd also like to thank the nearly 70 members of the Luncheon Committee. The names of these extraordinary women are in your program. They've done a spectacular job. In fact, we're expecting 500 people at today's lecture and luncheon. And would all of the committee members please stand as well? Yeah. So I want to express my gratitude to the Women in Science chairs and committee members for bringing us all together today. Your dedication and your hard work have made Women in Science an integral part of the university. Now, Women in Science was launched in 1997 to encourage New York women in business and philanthropy to embrace science as a passionate interest and to learn about discoveries related to women's health. Since the initiative was founded 14 years ago, Women in Science has raised more than $15 million to support talented women pursuing careers in the sciences at the Rockefeller University. And I'm delighted to announce that through the great generosity of our Women in Science participants, we've raised over $1 million so far this year. This is wonderful, and thank you. So I want to thank everyone who's contributed to the Women in Science program, and I'd also like to thank in particular those who have contributed to the Women in Science Partners in Discovery program. These funds have had an enormous impact. Over the years, 132 graduate students and postdoctoral fellows have received Women in Science fellowships. Many of them are in attendance today, as are a number of women on the Rockefeller faculty, and even a few men. They will be joining us for lunch, and I'm sure they will be happy to talk with you about their work. Now, would the Women in Science Fellows please stand? Finally, I'd like to mention how delighted I was to learn that Rockefeller has established such a robust initiative dedicated to women. Not only does Women in Science educate the public about the importance of basic and clinical research, it also strives to help us improve the representation of women scientists at the university, and that's a cause that happens to be very close to my heart. I'm not the only scientist in the family. My wife, Mary, is also a neuroscientist, currently at Stanford University. When she joins me in New York this summer, once our son and daughter have finished school for the year, she'll continue her work on Parkinson's disease here at Rockefeller, and I know she looks forward to joining us at next year's Women in Science events. So now it's time to turn to our program today, Scent and Behavior, an Evocative Relationship. Research by our speaker, Leslie Vosshall, touches on everything from human sexuality to the evolution of the mosquito. and the implications of her work are as groundbreaking as they are diverse. Leslie is a neuroscientist and geneticist who first came to Rockefeller as a Ph.D. student working in the laboratory of Professor Michael Young. Today, Leslie is the university's Robin Chemmers-Neustein Professor and head of the Laboratory of Neurogenetics and Behavior. Much of her research focuses on the odor perception system of insects to understand how sensory information is communicated to and then processed in the brain. And as you'll hear, since 2004, Leslie and her research group have been conducting clinical trials looking at the genetics of odor perception and preferences in humans. Now, I understand that a few years ago, at an earlier Women in Science luncheon, one of our Women in Science committee members offered to introduce Leslie to a friend who shares Leslie's obsession with scent. As you might have guessed, this is how Leslie met Frédéric Malle, today's special guest. Since then, Leslie and Frédéric have learned that they have quite a lot to talk about, and they will continue their conversation today here in front of all of you. Frédéric is an internationally recognized nose. As you know, that's a technical term in the industry. He's the founder and owner of the Paris-based company Édition de Parfum Frédéric Malle. Mr. Malle is known for the innovation and creativity he employs in the design of his scents. As the grandson of Serge Hefler, the founder of Dior perfumes, Frédéric has always been surrounded by the art and the craft of fragrance. A gifted perfumer in his own right, he's also worked with some of the greatest perfumers of the day. We're so pleased that Monsieur Malle is with us today, and we look forward to learning a bit more about his work. So after we hear from Leslie and Frédéric, we will then open the program for discussion and questions from the audience, and I'd ask that you please hold your questions until that time. So now it's my pleasure to present Dr. Vosshall. Please join me in welcoming her to the podium.
So excited to be here. Everyone looks and smells divine. So I have to thank Gigi Mortimer, who is the reason that we're all here. So Gigi is the one who introduced me to Frédéric. And so it's a really special day. I'm glad to see that Gigi's here, a longtime supporter of Women in Science. I should also say that everything I'm going to say today is going to be centered around the women in my laboratory. There's been over 74 women in my lab in the past and present, including this young woman, Louise Malle, who was an outreach student 2 summers ago and who happens to be the daughter of Frédéric. So not only do I get access to the world's greatest perfumes, we have Frédéric here today, but I also had some labor in my lab through this relationship. So I'm going to jump through 2 big stories about smell. The first is how does smell work, how do humans interact with smell, and if I have time, we'll talk about how mosquitoes think about the sense of smell. So this is the question, how does smell work? How does it really work? I stayed up until 3 in the morning last night trying to figure out how it works. Frédéric and I have had many discussions about it. It's actually very complicated. It's very complicated for scientists to understand, and even more complicated to find a way to explain it to non-scientists. So this is my attempt. So the first thing that happens when you encounter something smelly, like the azaleas outside, is that it's a little bit disgusting, but chemicals go into your nose. If you don't sniff, you don't smell. So if you hold your breath, you won't smell. So it's important that the chemicals go into the nose. And then the problems begin. The plants and other things have no problems producing chemicals, but the problem is, how does the nose tell the difference between, these are just shapes to illustrate different odor molecules. The green star, the yellow oval, the blue dots. The nose has to figure out how many of these chemicals are present, in what concentration, and then figure out what they mean. Because each of these chemicals in isolation can mean nothing, but you have to put the pattern together to be able to figure out that it's this. It's actually a terrible picture because Alströmerium has no smell at all. But most perfume ads have orchids that don't smell. So that's be a skeptic when you look at advertisements. So this is the problem. How first does the nose decode this, and then how does the brain decode it? We know a little bit about how the nose decodes this. Thanks to the work of my former mentor, Richard Axel, and his then postdoc Linda Buck. Linda is one of the, I think, 7 women in the history of the Nobel Prize to win the Nobel Prize for physiology or medicine. And so Linda and Richard figured out that deep in your nose, there are proteins that look like this. So these are odorant receptors, and the pink bits of the proteins are specialized to bind all of those different odor molecules that I've schematized as the green star, the yellow oval, the blue dot. And so these proteins grab onto those molecules, feel them, and then decide what to do with them, either get activated by the odor molecule or ignore it. And so we have about 400 of these. So that's a lot. That's a lot of genes. A huge proportion of our DNA is devoted to smell, so smell is very important to our DNA. So is this enough for us to smell everything? I have to first take a little detour to figure out how vision works. So these are violets, which have a beautiful smell, but they also have vision. They also have a visual input. So vision is really pretty simple. So with just 3 visual receptors, blue, green, and red, we can see 10 million colors. And so you can actually do a lot with just 3 genes. But light is pretty simple, right? Light is all the same quality. It's all the same substance. It just differs in energy. But the problem for the nose is that there'd be no way we could do it with 3, so we need more. And so the average human, most of you will have about 400. Each of you will have a different set of receptors, which explains why there are big disagreements about if something smells good or bad, and if it's strong or weak, because we're all a little bit different. And I'm going to make the case that 400 odorant receptors really is enough to smell everything. If you can smell millions, if you can see millions of wavelengths of light, you can certainly smell a very, very large number of odors out there. Every odor that exists now and every odor that will ever exist as made by a perfume company. And that's because of the special property of these proteins that they are able to sample olfactory space by a combination. So a given receptor can bind lots of different smells in different ways, and a particular smell can activate lots of receptors. So this combination, you can actually smell a vast number, and the number is unknown, how many odor molecules there are. So this is my attempt to explain how we think it works. If we take each of the 400 receptors and make it as a little circle, this would be you in an odor-free room. This is you at JFK Airport at the end, where all the air has been filtered, and you're far away from the duty-free perfume shops. There's really nothing going on in the nose. It's just quiet. Now let's see if you smell vanilla. It's a really beautiful scent. It's a pretty simple scent. Everybody agrees that vanilla smells like vanilla. You might activate these receptors strongly, these receptors a little bit weakly, and these very weakly. So this could be the code for how the brain perceives vanilla. And you might imagine if you were a person who's missing these 2 receptors, you might not be able to smell vanilla at all. And of the 400 people that we've looked at in great detail, about 5% can't smell vanilla at all. They're otherwise perfectly normal, but we think if we look into their DNA, which we're doing, they're unhappy because they can't really sense the beauty of desserts or the Starbucks vanilla latte. But if we were to look into their genes, my prediction would be that they would be missing these major receptors, and that's something that we're in the middle of doing. What if you take something more complex like jasmine? So jasmine is a big perfume ingredient from these beautiful flowers. It's a really complex odor. I don't know what jasmine does to the nose, but my cartoon illustration is it probably is activating lots of receptors. But what's interesting is that there's some overlap between vanillin and jasmine, which we know that there's something in common in the scents that come off of these flowers. What happens if you turn up the volume on the jasmine and make it really strong? We know that if you're in an elevator with someone who's doused themselves with cheap aftershave, it can be a little stingy, a little bit unpleasant. It can last for a long time. And so the idea is that you start to overwhelm the olfactory system and you start activating lots of other receptors, some of which might give you a picture of unpleasantness of something. And so the nose is able to first figure out what's out there. This flower will give off hundreds of odors, as Frédéric can confirm. The hundreds of odors go on to this matrix and activate it in different complex ways. When you dump on a lot by turning on the volume, you all of a sudden activate a lot of stuff that starts to give you the off smell of jasmine, which is why perfumers are very good at tuning how much smell is in a particular formula. And there's some beautiful case studies of this. This is the civet cat, and there's an anal gland that perfumers extract to get this extract, which I had a chance to smell once at Firmenich in Geneva. It is the most terrifying scent. It just makes you shiver to smell it. It's so, I wish I had some so you could all smell it. But it's not something that you'd want to wear because it makes you terrified, and so you wouldn't put it on. But a little known secret is that natural ingredients from this cat or chemical derivatives that are similar are added to many, many, many perfumes. So they're sort of in the background of a lot of perfumes. And another example that I really love is that a really, really strong French roast from a coffee shop has a little bit of a hint of skunk in it. So the idea is that the olfactory system can smell a very large number of smells, can tell how many molecules are present, and then can assign meaning to them, and the meaning will change. So you would never confuse a skunk with a cup of coffee, but your mind can see that there's some elements of commonality between those cues. There's one additional kind of interesting illusion, which is that scents can interact with each other in unpredictable ways. So if you're a child and you're mixing paints, usually you can predict what happens. With smell, it's not the case. And so here's a good example. So bourgeonal lily of the valley, let's say it activates, we know what this receptor is. It's called OR17-4. It's present in the nose, and it's present in sperm. I can't gesturing, so sperm, the men in the audience. So the idea is that this receptor is smelling lily of the valley, and that sperm are using this receptor to smell the egg. It's kind of a cool, interesting story. And accidentally, this group in Germany, Hans Hutt's group, figured out that this odor, Eau de Canal, which is a kind of a waxy orange scent, activates a completely different code. So it activates a completely different code, but it has some mystical effect on this receptor. And so if you smell first Eau de Canal and then lily of the valley, the receptor is completely off, and you cannot smell lily of the valley at all. And it's a trick that you can all come to my lab and do. It's really, it's as if the same vial of lily of the valley was converted to water just by smelling Eau de Canal briefly beforehand. And this is something that I think perfumers notice all the time, that it's a very empirical art, because we know so little about what happens even here in the nose. Forget about understanding what happens in the brain. We really don't understand it. And so that's why perfume is an art, because you can't scientifically, it's not like writing music where you can write down the notes and figure out what's going to happen. Scent still has some surprises built into it, and it's good. I still have a couple of years to work in my lab. We still have stuff to figure out. I think it's also important to note that a lot of things I've shown you are beautiful florals or artificial chemicals. Smell is, of course, hugely affected by culture, and so you go around the world and you have people smell these things. In Asia, a big block of congealed, moldy animal secretions, which is cheese, it's not a favorite food. People don't like the smell of it. But in France, it's a beautiful food source. Conversely, durian, which is most people in the West think is an incredibly repellent fruit, is a prized delicacy in Asia. So I think you can learn to overcome. The code may be telling you, don't eat this. It's moldy, don't eat this. But experience can overcome this biological aversion. This stuff also is really vile, but you can overcome it because culture will help you understand it. And of course, garlic and cilantro are other axes where there's big cultural imprints about if you like it or not. And there's huge disagreements about if cilantro is the best herb ever or the most vile thing ever. Some of which are cultural and some of which are genetic. And so my lab, since about 2004, we were a fly lab, and we discovered along the way the flies are terrible at reporting their emotions verbally. So they're really terrible. You ask them, what does it smell like? And we have all these indirect measures. Many days the flies don't feel like doing anything, they don't behave. And so we turn to New Yorkers who, with cash payments meted out by our finance department, will report how they're feeling. And New York is a great place to work because it's an enormous concentration of human life and culture, and so we can get a very, very diverse population. A number of you in the audience I know have participated in our studies, and thank you for your participation. And so all these dots represent the last known address of the people that we've tested. And the question that we were after is to try to capture a snapshot of New Yorkers interacting with scents. We set them up we have a beautiful hospital where we do these studies in the outpatient clinic. We present people with hundreds of vials of odors. We give them some suggestive adjectives like sour milk, wet wool, wet dog, raw cucumber, to solve the problem of tongue-tiedness. So if you're presented with a smell, it's difficult for people to come up with adjectives. They can say, I like it or I hate it, but even if you give someone vanilla, they can't figure out that it's vanilla without this list of adjectives. So we ask, how sensitive are people to smells? How do they feel about them? How to identify them? And the overall goal is to tease apart this difference between culture and genetics. And one odor that we were really interested in are these two odors, androstadienone and androstenone, which are sort of sexy chemicals that you can purchase on the internet that are alleged, if you're a man, if you bathe yourselves in them, it will increase your sex appeal. And they're widely touted to be pheromones. And so we've been after trying to come up with evidence for what is the evidence that humans really use these for subliminal communication. So if you ask people, you give them a list of 150 adjectives, they're really good at agreeing that vanilla smells like vanilla. Androstenone, they're all over the place. Bark birch, animal, sweaty, putrid, buttery, fresh cleaning fluid. And then even more astonishing, we're not the first to see this, but about 10% of New Yorkers can't smell this at all. So they think we're tricking them, they think it's water. And so we and many others were on the hunt for that gene, which is the receptor in the array that explains this. How can you have people that can't smell this but are otherwise normal? And in my heart of hearts, I want to know what else is wrong with them if they can't smell the man smell, right? Does it affect their social life and their dating? So I have to go back to color vision. So if you lose one of these three input channels, and you can then only see red and blue, the world looks very different, right? So color blindness has been shown to be due to the loss of genes. So if you're a woman and you lose these two green genes but retain these, you're fine. But your son may not be fine. So your son, if he inherits this chromosome, will be red-green colorblind. And this is very prevalent. And the prevalence is increasing because we don't medically select against it, right? It's not a genetic disorder that we test for or select against. So 7% of men, and increasing every year, are red-green colorblind. And it's very rare in women because we have the very handy extra X chromosome that will cure us of this. So we were interested in trying to find, can we find an analogous situation for man smell, for the androstenone, androstadienone. And so we hunted with our collaborators for one of these 400 receptors whose job it was to smell Burt Lancaster's man smell. And so we found a gene called OR74, which is exquisitely tuned. It only cares about androstenone, androstadienone, doesn't care about any of these other odors. And when we sequenced the DNA of all 400 people, we could start correlating how they feel about the man smell versus their genes. And we could figure out that here's a picture of this receptor. And so if you have a genetic mistake here and a genetic mistake here, then you will not be able to, this receptor is then broken and you won't be able to smell the substance in quite the same way. And so what we figured out is that people who are missing even just one copy of this gene stop using these adjectives, sweaty, musky, musty, moldy, dirty linen, sweaty, and they start calling it more like vanilla. So this is really the first case where we think we have assigned a genetic defect to the smell of the substance. But we wanted to go further, and we wanted to test what really happens in women when they're smelling this, and the video is not going. So we wanted to ask, is there a subliminal input pathway? If it's a pheromone, you want to not just be able to smell it and say, ooh, sex. You want to just have a subliminal input. And so we've been testing women at the peak of ovulation, which is very complicated, finding 90 women under the age of 35 who are not on the pill, not pregnant, and in town for 6 months. It was incredibly complicated. But we found them, and we found 90 women who were managed to ovulate continuously for 6 months and be in the study. And we could then look into their DNA, and we could confirm that women who are missing one copy of OR74, again, are much less able to detect the man smell. But we wanted to figure out, these women who cannot detect the man smell consciously, can't tell it apart from water, is it having an effect on them, right? So if they're smelling it, water has no effect on people, right? But can we get these people who can't detect this stuff? And the answer is absolutely yes. So if we look at their mood before and after smelling this stuff, people who can smell androstadienone report being much less interested and much more bored after smelling the stuff. And we find exactly the same mood changes in people who can't smell it. So huge mood changes relative to smelling odors, smelling these male-derived odors. That we don't see with other odors. And then furthermore, if we look at their cortisol, which is a stress hormone, we find that whether or not you can smell it, you have huge effects on your stress hormone, that this is actually calming women down. Smelling this is subliminally calming them down. So this is a kind of a cool demonstration that there is a potential genetic pathway in the human nose and the human brain that allows women to smell these substances. So now I have 1 minute. I think I should just stop at this point. Should I stop? Do a little bit more? Okay. So what else is smell good for? So others, using the University of Pennsylvania smell identification test, have figured out that the sense of smell is one of the first things that goes awry in either psychiatric or neurological disorders. So here's data showing really, really good smell identification skills in normal elderly subjects. And with mildly cognitively impaired schizophrenics or those suffering with Alzheimer's disease, the identification goes down very, very far. And so this is a possibility that, in addition to other diagnostics, that the sense of smell could be an early warning system for the function of the brain. And then the last thing I'll talk about is how we can use the sense of smell to sniff out human disease. So in the old days, doctors used to actually touch and smell their patients, and there's a whole list of diseases that have associated odors that are sensed in the breath or in the urine. Some of these diseases we don't have anymore, like smallpox, but some of them we absolutely do. So some of these infectious diseases and some of these metabolic diseases. So it's a really rapid, serious way to identify what disease a person has. But what do we do today? We mostly have these indirect means. There's not a lot of touching. Blood or urine are collected. Your brain is scanned to look for diseases. Could we get back to some of these 19th century ways of diagnosing diseases? So there's been a lot of stuff in the press about cancer-sniffing dogs. And I traced this week to try to learn where the hype comes from. So there was one report in 1989 that one woman with one dog, the dog was sniffing a lesion on her leg, which was later found to be metastatic melanoma. And so that got people excited about the idea that you could train dogs to sniff medical conditions, that there's something about the body that is changing. Just like if you have liver failure, something will happen to your metabolism that will make you give off different scents. This was finally put to a real test in 2004, where 7 dogs were used for testing. It took them 7 months to train the dogs, smelling the urine of subjects suffering from bladder cancer. The dogs did pretty well. By chance, you give them 7 cups. They have to lie down next to the one of the patient with bladder cancer. By chance, they would get 14% correct. The dogs did 3 times better, 41% correct. So that's pretty promising. There's some little funny things here. The papillon, doesn't matter what breed of dog it is. And there was one normal control the dogs kept lying down next to, and the person was then subsequently diagnosed with early stage bladder cancer. So that is really, it's kind of exciting if you get early cancer diagnosis. But how is this really possible? Dogs are really good at smelling. You have to train them for a year. The diagnosis is only 41% accurate, right? And you have to feed, walk them. They get distracted by stuff on the ground. They age. So could we do something more intelligent, a little bit like what Frédéric does with his company? Could we figure out Frédéric figures out what's in the flower. What's the chemical signature of the flower? Could we figure out what's the chemical signature of the cancer? We do this all the time. Those of you who have the lovely experience of being at the airport, when they're swabbing your hand, they're swabbing it for a chemical signature of a plastic explosive, which they put into an electronic nose. And so if we could just figure out what is the signature of a healthy control, if these are the odor molecules that you're breathing out or that are in your urine, if you could train an electronic nose to see that maybe this compound increases a lot if you have a kind of cancer, or maybe some completely new metabolite comes up. If you could train the nose to do that, then I think that we could have something interesting where smell intersects with medicine. And I'm going to stop there.
Well, thank you, Leslie, for this fascinating presentation. At this time, I'd like to invite Frédéric to join Leslie and myself on the stage. So I'm going to ask a few questions. Since we've just heard from Leslie, I'll ask a couple of questions of Frédéric. And first question, how does one become a perfumer? And is there a science to being or becoming a nose? Are perfumers necessarily those with the best noses, or are there other factors that are involved?
I think it's mostly passion. Being a perfumer is very, very difficult. It's very, very tedious. It's not like being a painter where you sort of splash things on the canvas and have sort of like immediate reward. It's research, sort of looking for a shape, and then once you have that olfactory shape, making hundreds of trials to get it right. So if you're not completely passionate about it, it's not for you. Also, learning about perfume takes 20 years. I mean, I was having dinner the other day with Dominique Ropion, who's arguably the best perfumer in the world today. And Marie, my wife, asked him how long it took him to be good. And very relaxed, he said, like 20 years, 22 years. So you have to be quite patient. Now, in the old days, it was French sport exclusively for men from the south of France. And it was the bad students from the French schools that were becoming perfumers. Now it's quite different. It's men and women from all over the world that have been thinking of perfume since they are kids, that want that as a life and have, and nothing else. So that's how you become a perfumer, basically.
So it sounds like there are lots of studies that have come out recently. To become expert at anything, you have to spend 10,000 hours, I think it is. And so it sounds like you need to spend 10,000 hours to become a perfumer as well. Can you tell us a little bit about your company? Leslie alluded to it, what you do in the company.
My company works exactly like a publishing house. I mean, 10 years ago, we realized with a group of perfumer friends that happened to be the best perfumers in the industry, that the industry had completely shifted to create fragrances that were really tailored for the mass market. Leslie was talking about the duty-free. Those fragrances were made for the duty-free. So basically those artists, those very artistic perfumers were asked to do the same fragrance over and over again. I was a coach for them. It's a very peculiar job in this business. It's called an evaluator. They worked with me, and I sort of assessed their job. And we realized that we were all incredibly bored of doing the same thing over and over again. So we decided to create a company by which we would make a selection of the best perfumers and let them work completely freely without marketing pressure, financial limits, time pressure, etc., etc., etc. Going back to making fragrances like they were made in the old days, although using modern technologies. In other words, making fragrance like works of art. So that's how we started that 10 years ago in Paris with one little shop, and since that we grew a little bit, and now we have a shop in Madison.
And so you have outlets here in New York too?
Yes, we work with Barney's. We've been working with Barney's for 10 years, and we have just opened a store a year ago on Madison Avenue.
And what are some of your favorite fragrances of the ones that you've made?
This one is pretty nice. I mean, the ones that I'm always the most excited about is the last one. It's called Portrait of a Lady. I love D'Entrebras that Leslie is wearing today. Crown of Flowers, very, very good. I mean, basically, when you ask the best perfumers in the industry to do what they want with no limits, I mean, you can't really go wrong. They're all pretty good. Sorry to be bragging. Yeah. A bit embarrassing.
Well, maybe I can turn to Leslie now. And Leslie, could you tell us a little bit about scent and memory? Why is a familiar smell such a potent trigger of long ago events? I think we're all familiar with Proust's wonderful description of, as an adult, biting into that Madeleine that had been dipped in tea, and memories of his childhood came flooding back, which he had forgotten completely up to that point. So what do we know about that?
The Proust example is interesting. The Proust example is a little bit more about taste than smell, so I think it's sort of abused as an idea. But it's true that anything can trigger a recovered memory. You can see a picture, you can hear music. Taste is rarer, but smell is different. I think because it catches people by surprise. Because if you're smelling something that you last smelled 20 years ago that sort of grabs the deep parts of your brain, it gets your attention much more than other things. And so there is something about the wiring of the nose into the brain that's much more direct. So there's many fewer stops along the way toward the parts of the brain that process the information. So that's one idea, is that it takes much longer for visual cues to make it from the external world to where you can react to it. And so smell can be a bit faster and more primal.
I see, so both the immediacy and also the short connection.
That's right.
But sorry, I'm asking a question. When the 400 sensors sort of send that message to your brain, it sends it to a decoder on one side, but doesn't...
The nose is really weird. The nose is the only, it's a part of your brain that's outside the brain. Mm-hmm. So it's really, these neurons go directly through little holes in the top of your nose at the bottom of the skull. They go right into the brain. That's why people deliver drugs through the nose. Mm-hmm. So it's the only, that was a bit naughty. It's the only part of the sensory system that's directly connected to the brain, and so there's just fewer relays. So the coders speak directly to the brain. The visual system, there's many relay stations until you get to the brain.
Right.
So, Frédéric, maybe I can pick up one of the themes that Leslie mentioned, which was the cultural component to smell. Could you elaborate on that a little bit? What do we know about when that learning occurs, as it were, that the cultural influences occur, and do they have to occur early in life? Can they occur later? What do you know about cultural influences on smell?
Well, I think it's a bit of both. It's the chicken and the egg thing. It's a complicated. Honestly, we don't really know. I mean, part of it is genetic, part of it is cultural. Leslie was talking about pheromones. It's basically, since the fragrance industry exists, or even before, I mean, we have been making fragrances to make people attractive, to make people sexy. I mean, it's, in a very little nutshell, it's the name of the game. So at the turn of the century, I mean, you know, people like Guerlain or Caron used to sort of slaughter goats to sort of extract their musk and put them in fragrances, and that's how most of the French classics have been made, with sort of, you know, natural musk in them. Then we developed things that, chemically, that were in those families, believing that that's how we would sort of create sexy fragrances. Then there was a man actually in the 80s who thought that he really had it, who really had found the secret to making great fortune in our business, and he launched fragrances made mostly with pheromones. They didn't sell at all, and they were not considered sexy at all. So really, my feeling, and that's maybe it's a hope for my business and for the artistry of it, is that there is a scientific part, there's a rational part to it, but also we inherit this sort of sense of this acquired taste for sexiness, those sort of pre-made images. I don't know, maybe ladies with high Louboutin heels or things like that. I mean, that you sort of learn along the you know, along your life. But basically, there are fragrance structures that we know sort of generate that sense. And that's the way we sort of build fragrances that we think are right. But it's a very sort of nondescript, vague sort of idea that we are trying to tap. It's not scientific at all. So that's I don't know if I'm answering properly, but that's my view on that.
Leslie, do you have any other further thoughts on the cultural issue?
Well, I think what's interesting is that there are very few perfumes that are worldwide blockbusters. There are perfumes that do well in Europe that are different from those that do well in Japan. My feeling has always been that part of that is cultural, that the people in different parts of the world, if you smell a dishwashing soap in Europe, it has these strange fruity flavors that we don't ever put into dishwashing soap here. So there are very different preferences. the scientist in me also believes that we are a big human tribe, but we are genetically different from each other in subtle ways, according to our origin. And I think that some of those things will affect the 400 detectors. So that there may be a cohort of people in some part of the world that just smell scent X differently because they just don't have the receptors for it. And so marketing a perfume that features the scent for receptor X is useless because it will just smell like garbage to them. And so that's always been my hope, is that we can integrate the science of smell with the art of smell to really engineer perfumes. Maybe a very future dream, but...
There's one thing on that side, sorry if I may bounce on this. Now it's more of a global market, and those large companies are trying to sort of cater fragrances that would please everybody. That's why they are sort of lowest common denominators, and that's why they are very short-lived, because people don't really cling on to them. But I remember when I started more than 20 years ago, I realized that America would have a very, very specific taste. And they would have a taste for two things: oriental notes that are considered quite sweet, like Guerlain, like Obsession, like that sort of vanilla-based fragrances, and for tuberose fragrances. That was the sort of two big markets. And I thought that it was always interesting for two reasons. First of all, in slightly more puritanical society than we have, like we have in Europe, for instance, when people wear a fragrance, if they dare wearing a fragrance, they want something that smells quite strong. So they go for these structures because they are not faint. They are the sort of two very powerful ones. So you can almost link that to religion. When you are in a Protestant country, you either don't wear fragrances or you wear strong ones because you want something for your money. That's one of these rules. The other thing is that in America, and I've been to school here and I've been living here for more than 5 years now, one can see that you eat much sweeter foods, from hamburgers to ice creams to bubblegums. I mean, America eats more sugar than Europe. And therefore, Americans having that sweet tooth are going for oriental fragrances because it's part of their taste and part of their, and maybe it's affecting, the 400 things, but it's maybe inbred by now, but it's also cultural. We go for colognes.
Maybe I'll ask just two more questions, and then we can open the floor to questions from the audience. I've been told, and I don't know whether this is true, maybe you can confirm it, that some of the greatest perfumes of the past used natural scents that are now extinct. Is that the case? Or that are extremely expensive to source?
Not really. I think yes, they use natural scents with chemicals, because perfumery since the end of the 19th century has been using quite a lot of chemicals. And it's chemicals that allowed us to make very, very precise fragrances on the one hand, and also it's chemicals that allowed us to sort of explore new type of smells, because when there are chemicals that don't smell like nature at all, and therefore they become like a new color to our palette. So since 1889, which was Jiki, which was it's the last surviving of those first fragrances, we have been using chemicals and naturals together. Now, most of the naturals that were available in the 19th century are still available. The provenance sometimes have changed. So for instance, when people used to put ylang-ylang in their fragrances in the 20s, namely people like Chanel or Guerlain, they would source it in the Philippines. Now it comes from South America. So you go from Beaujolais to Bordeaux. I mean, this is a slight difference, but it's still ylang-ylang. And what we do to it is that through high-tech process, we sort of process the South American ylang so that it's twisted into something that smells like the original Filipino one. So we haven't lost much. But this sort of opens a whole big chapter of rules and regulations that we are really sort of abiding very, very, very thoroughly in our business. We are a self-regulated business. And we have something which is very similar to the Food and Drug Administration, except that we run it, although it's a completely independently run system. And we have very, very, very stringent rules about what we are allowed to put in fragrances or not. There are recommendations, but everybody better sort of go by them. So there are substances, for instance, like those natural, like civet, for instance. Although we didn't kill the civets, we didn't do any harm to them. Just the idea of touching civets, like having a fur coat, is completely forbidden. So we have chemical reproductions of them. So that's for the animal notes. And then there are from natural ingredients, very often carry molecules, chemicals, natural chemicals, if you can put it this way, that are not good for men. They can be phototoxic, they can create itches, they can generate allergies and all that. And so what we do is that we extract these chemicals from the naturals. So therefore they are like, decaffeinated coffee to coffee. They're not exactly the same, but and so some people think that they're not as good, but it's the way we work now, as it's a very sort of health-conscious business.
They're not as they may not be as natural, but they may be better for you, is what you would argue.
They are better for us.
I see. So maybe I can just ask Leslie the last question, or Frédéric, feel free to weigh in as well. Leslie, you spoke about gender differences, and specifically as they relate to pheromones. But if we move away from pheromones and just talk about everyday scents, are there big differences between men and women in how they perceive scents? And then maybe I'll ask both of you, sort of the perception at an objective level, if that's possible, versus the emotional content, which might be different. So at an objective or physiological level, are there well-characterized differences?
So with the benefit of data, millions of data points from 400 New Yorkers, I can answer that very simply. So overall, women are much more sensitive to all the smells that we tested 66 different smells. So women in general are much more sensitive to smells than men. And the number one odor that women are much more sensitive to in general than men is androstenedione, which is the sex steroid-derived odor. It's the byproduct of testosterone. So that makes some innate biological sense that if the men are sending a signal, that then the receiver should be particularly sensitive to it. That said, we're all different, and so you could find examples of men with a very, very strong sense of smell, but just cutting it by gender, we could see those differences. We could also cut it by race, and we could come up with this idea that Asians are more sensitive to and or prefer these scents more than Caucasians or African Americans, teasing apart how much of that is cultural, how much of that is biological is a big problem.
But again, if you go into this sample in your particular study, which
Yes.
of course I guess your caveat is it might be different in different populations, but if you look at the men and the women and you forget that the one very strong difference, everyday scents, vanilla and things like that, are there major differences?
Across the board, so if you just look at a metric of overall olfactory acuity, women are much more sensitive to scents. There's about 10 or 20 odors of the 66 that women are more sensitive to. A lot of those are florals and spicy scents. And on the men's side, men are more sensitive to a couple of things that are typically used in aftershave. So I think some of this may just be experience. I think it may be cultural or experience-based. It seemed like you could read off the perfume ingredients for men and women's targeted perfumes and see that there's differences between genders.
Also, there are things that in fragrances that have been used in so many men's colognes that saying, you are a tough guy type of thing. That basically men sort of tend to cling on to them more easily, but it's a purely cultural thing.
I see.
I would think.
So in fact, it sounds like teasing apart the purely genetic difference from the cultural influences could prove to be very difficult.
Well, we have these great new sequencing machines, and so we fully intend to tease it apart soon.
Good. So I think at this point, maybe we can take some questions from the audience, and we'll try to go all the way around here. If I could ask you to wait until the microphone reaches you. The first person I saw raise a hand was over there, the lady with the hat. That's right. Yeah. And
I have two questions. One, it was fascinating when you talk about the use of memory and how that is affected by scent. And I wondered whether the field of psychiatry has ever thought of therapeutically using scent as a dynamic kind of therapeutic tool. And the second question is, you spoke about how all of us respond very differently. And I wondered, why do some of us have a very strong reaction? You can smell the scent, and on others, you don't even know the perfume is on.
I'll answer the second one first, just because I remember it better. So why are there differences? I'll bring you back to my grid of 400 dots. So I would say maybe you have a super sensitive receptor for smell X, and so you're just genetically endowed with this really strong receptor. And so the same amount of odor molecule going into your nose has just a much bigger effect. So there could be a simple genetic explanation for it. Some people are generally more sensitive to all smells, but there's a lot of people who have specific sensitivities to specific smells, and I think that is going to be genetic. The first question, that would be very cool if you could deal with post-traumatic stress disorder by exposing people to something that would really get them to respond. The puzzle is, how do you figure out what's the chemical composition of the stuff? If you had some traumatic event, how do you capture the odor molecules that were there at that time? So I think practically it's difficult. Psychologists are playing with memory and smell a little bit by these fun experiments. If you take students and you make them cram for a test, memorize things in the presence of a lavender odor, and then they sleep, and then you puff lavender into the air when they're sleeping, and then on test day you puff lavender into the air, they just do better. So I think that's on the border between psychology and wackiness, but it could one day be science.
But there's another thing also about that, about memory, is that fragrances, for instance, are extremely relative. And I've often sort of experienced that, for instance, with old classics that haven't been made anymore and that we had the recipe for. And people sort of craving for these things, then you make the fragrance for them, which is exactly that fragrance, and there's no doubt about it. We have the formula, we have the ingredients, we have everything. And they say, oh, it's not at all the same thing. You're like, fine. But because basically it's exactly like colors. We're really influenced by the colors of the moment, whether it's fashion, whether the world evolves. And fragrances, the taste in fragrances also evolves, and our nose and brain sort of see things through a different sort of prism after a while. And so when you go back to smelling something from the past, even though it's we could make the same smell, sometimes you sort of completely miss it. You don't recognize it as it was. It's like going back to your childhood house and realizing that in fact it was incredibly small.
That's right. Front row here.
Leslie, you said if you had time you'd tell us about mosquitoes. Could you tell us a little bit about your malaria research?
I know, I feel so inept that I didn't plan this properly. So we are interested in developing new repellents that will stop mosquitoes from biting humans. We've gotten quite far with that with funding from Bill and Melinda Gates. And Lindsay Dick, who some of you will be privileged to have lunch with, is a graduate student, Women in Science fellow. She's trying to figure out why mosquitoes bite some people and not others. And so we're recruiting people who are always bitten and people who are never bitten. So.
Question up there. Here on the right.
It seems to me that the sense of smell is really so primordial. It's in the wild, animals use their sense of smell much more than we do. Is that something that has changed as humans have evolved? And have we lost our ability to smell as versus our caveman ancestors?
That argument has been made because we walk upright, we don't walk on the ground sniffing. We have beautiful trichromic color vision, so the argument's been made that we don't need the sense of smell. And people would argue that humans have a poor sense of smell relative to rats or dogs. We do pretty well with 400 receptors, so humans have pretty good, if you press humans and ask them in the right way, they do pretty well. But we are multisensory, we don't depend on it. We don't forage for food in the dark like rats. And so we need it, usually, we don't need it as much.
I think we'll go over to that side. Well, over here, maybe.
Speak for the entire audience when I ask you this question, Leslie. Asparagus and pee.
Oh.
Is it that some people can't smell it, or that some people don't produce it?
My favorite experiment that I never was allowed to do. So this is the phenomenon that I hope they serve asparagus at lunch, because you can do the experiment. So you eat the asparagus, drink a lot of water, and then a half an hour later you go to the ladies' room and the men's room, and then you smell your pee, and about 60% of you will smell a totally new kind of a violet floral scent to the urine. It has been shown scientifically by scientists in Philadelphia that it is, everybody produces it, and being able to smell it or not comes down to one of those 400 sensors. So the asparagus urine odor phenomenon, it depends on how you think about it.
Question here.
I'm really enjoying it. How long does a perfume stay potent? And is it true that you can put it in, you should put perfume in a dark bottle and it stays better?
Okay, fragrances are fragile, are sensitive to three things. Oxygen, light, and change of temperatures. So the best way to keep a fragrance is to put it in your refrigerator, in fact. If you put it in a dark bottle, it's going to protect it from the light, that's for sure. So that's one part of your question. The life expectancy of a fragrance depends on the way it's composed. If it's a heavy fragrance with a lot of back notes, these tend to have a longer life expectancy because those less volatile substances don't age as fast. If you in the contrary, an eau de cologne, for instance, which is made mostly with very volatile things, tends to oxidate about after 18 months. So long story short, for an eau de cologne, it's about 18 months in regular usage. And for, I don't know, one of those heavy fragrances, you can keep it for three or 4 years.
I have visions of opening the refrigerator door, taking out what I think is the Tabasco sauce and putting it all over my hamburger.
The thing is that we keep fragrances in the worst place, which is the bathroom, where we have the huge shift in temperature every day we take a shower, whenever we take a shower. But unless you're a great fragrance collector, I mean, you know, those fragrances can last as long as you use them, and they're fine.
We'll go back to the middle there, towards the back. Yes? Yes, that lady there. Thank you.
Can you explain the chart?
Oh, yes. Sorry. It's quite simple. I realized when I started working in this business that people talk a language which is completely abstract. You go to, I mean, either you have people that are extremely humbled by our language because they don't know it, others that believe that know it and should be humbled by it because they have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. Sort of say, oh, I want a chypre, and so that's that part. Or I want an oriental, I want this or that, and they're talking Chinese. So I try to make this more simple, although this looks a bit complicated. Basically, if you sort of look at it from a layman point of view or a normal person point of view, fragrances can be either very fresh and transparent, so that's the top of the chart, or at the contrary, they can be extremely compact and generally then a bit warmer, so that's that part. So for instance, if you take, I mean, these are my fragrances, but if you take sort of usual classics, for instance, a Shalimar or a Miss Dior would be here, and an eau de cologne, you would be there. Now, you can see that in, with more perspective, and what's warm can be sweet, or can be also sort of more streamlined, like a flower, for instance, which is like a green vegetal thing. So basically, we have made this map to be able to sort of place our fragrances and to describe them. Now, the funny potatoes on the back, in fact, are sort of referring to the classical odor classification that perfumers use. Now, this classification, honestly, I believe has no real interest, and it's not trying to sort of shrink the language for the general public, because basically it's alluding to our fragrance recipes. It's interesting, but basically, you know, you don't wear a recipe, you wear something that smells good on you. The other thing is that with modern perfumery, the fact that we are using very, very precise materials that are chemicals allows us to mix all these different recipes. So therefore, it's become, I mean, the boundaries between those things are not as sharp as they used to be. Now, the way this goes is that this big potato is the Oriental world. If you take, for instance, ambery vanilla type of note, which is very sweet although heavy, you are in this world. Now, if you sort of make it more musky and fluffy and like mohair in a way, or like cashmere, you sort of go within there. So that's the world of Trésor, for instance. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Now, if you put more spice in the same sort of structure, this structure, and you go for noir épice or something like opium, you sort of go right because you're going to give more edges to your fragrance. And then if you go even darker with all these animalic notes, you go for that, and for instance, French lover, as it implies, is for men. And very dark, and for a man that really wants to sort of make you believe that he is a real man. So now, at the opposite of the spectrum, you have, so that's leather and all that. Opposite of the spectrum, you have all the citrus notes that are extremely transparent, that don't last, that are made like eau de colognes, and are giving you this sort of sense of freshness and this sense of, you know, cleanliness. They are almost like grooming products. Now, the whole middle thing is floracy. I mean, flowers are generally in this world, apart from tuberose, which is sort of quite low in the chart because it's a quite dark-smelling flower. So basically, you know, when I started many years ago, I was working with a perfumer from Grasse who told me, you know, flowers, they are like butter in French cuisine. You always put a little bit, and it will work. So as you can see, a lot of people are following that advice, and it's covering quite a lot of the chart. And then this little moon there is for flowers that are, those sort of flower fragrances that have appeared in the 80s, like l'Odyssée, like what was it called? En passant is one. It's the flower with ozonic notes, where the sort of watery smell and the sort of seashore effect is exaggerated. So they're like almost like Photoshop flowers with more angles, sharper, hyper-realistic. So they're there. So that's that. And the crisscross on top, because it's only a two-dimensional thing, is to sort of is trying to say that it's all the sort of more vibrating, more crispy fragrances. What's out is sort of, all that is more sort of fluffy.
So we only have time for 2 more questions. We'll take one down here, and then we'll go to another part of the audience.
Is it possible to explain briefly the reliance of taste on smell?
Sure. So whenever you put something into your mouth, if you hold your nose, you you taste nothing. You taste the elements of taste. You taste sugar, sour, salt. And then you open the nose, and then you taste the full flavor. So whenever you chew something, the odor molecules are released into your mouth, and they go up through the retronasal pathway into your nose. So every time you're chewing, you're not only tasting, but you're smelling. And that information then reaches the brain more or less simultaneously. And so what's delicious? Let's say, I can't think of anything. An orange. So you're chewing on the orange, you get the sour of the orange, but you also get the odor molecules going into the nose, and then those things are brought together deeper in the brain to recreate a huge orange, right? The smell of an orange or the taste of an orange alone is not as big as actually eating it. So it's anatomy here on the face, and then bringing together of information in the brain that makes it work.
So one more question from the back here. If there are any questions up in the back? If not, we'll come down to the front. Okay, so, well, we see someone here raising their hand down in the front, so why don't we go ahead?
I'm wondering if there's evidence for those who are visually or hearing impaired to have a heightened sense of smell.
You can recreate this in animals, certainly. You can deprive an animal of one of the senses, and you can see that the part of the brain that used to function for that sense is invaded. So there's lots of biology that says that animals will adapt that way. I think anecdotally, I think it's true that people who have lost their sight have much more acute hearing and much more acute sense of smell. I'm not aware of, it's hard to find, to do that experiment in animals is easy. You deprive them of a sense and you look. In humans, you have to get volunteers and then look, test them, and then look at their brains. And so I don't think we have great scientific evidence for it, but my sense is that it absolutely is happening, that the brain will take over a part of unused territory and make the best use of it.
Well, I'd like to thank Leslie and Frédéric for their insightful comments.